General Hospital will reveal when the long-buried truth about Brook Lynn's past began to surface. The atmosphere inside the Quartermaine mansion shifted instantly from one of mundane routine to the eye of an emotional storm. The revelation didn't come through an orchestrated confession or a carefully laid plan. It erupted suddenly, an accidental slip during a heated argument with Tracy, when Brook Lynn, overwhelmed and cornered, blurted out a truth she had locked away for years. She had once become pregnant as a teenager and had given the child away for adoption. The words, raw and unfiltered, echoed like thunder through the corridors of the Quartermaine estate. Tracy was left speechless, her normally sharp and poised demeanor shattering into disbelief. A cocktail of horror, betrayal, and indignation surged through her veins. It wasn't merely the shocking realization that she was a great-grandmother, an identity she had never envisioned for herself, but the gut-wrenching idea that a Quartermaine heir had been lost to time and secrecy, slipping through her tightly clenched grip without her ever knowing it. In that moment, Tracy's mind didn't rush to visions of a toddler's first steps or a child's birthday party missed. Her thoughts flew directly to legacy, bloodline, and power. The idea that a potential heir to the Quartermaine fortune had been given away, raised in obscurity, and possibly molded by strangers, felt like a violation of everything she had spent her life protecting. To the outside world, a grandmother's grief might manifest in sorrow over the years missed, in longing to know and love the child she never met. But Tracy was not that grandmother. Her grief took the form of fury cloaked in control. Her sense of loss revolved not around hugs or lullabies, but around estate law and the family name. In her eyes, the child Brook Lynn gave away was not a person to cherish, but a vital asset that had been stolen, hidden, and cast aside, an heir to the Quartermaine empire that had been squandered due to youthful recklessness and Lois's misguided maternal interference. Unable to let the situation remain unresolved, Tracy took action in the only way she knew how, with force, money, and secrecy. She discreetly hired a private investigator, instructing him to comb through sealed records, hospital files, and adoption registries until he unearthed the truth about Brook Lynn's child. But as the investigation deepened, what was uncovered sent even Tracy reeling. The birth in question had not been of a single child, but of twins, a boy and a girl. The magnitude of the revelation left Tracy momentarily paralyzed. Her pulse quickened not only at the sheer drama of the double discovery but also at the name that surfaced alongside it, Dante. The father of the twins was none other than Dante, a man who had once entangled his life with Brook Lynn's and who now found himself unknowingly at the center of a far more complex family tapestry than he ever imagined. The knowledge hit Tracy like a freight train. Not only had Brook Lynn hidden the existence of two children, she had concealed the fact that they were Dante's, an officer of the law, a respected member of the community, and most importantly, a potential conduit of power if those children's lineage were to be recognized and reclaimed. To Tracy, this was no longer just a matter of personal betrayal. It was a full-scale Quartermaine scandal, with implications that threatened to unravel the very threads of the family's prestige and control. Fueled by indignation and a relentless desire to restore what she perceived as lost legacy, Tracy's fury grew tenfold. Her mind raced with strategies and retaliations. Who knew what? Who had conspired to keep this from her? And most crucially, where were the twins now? The boy, Gio, was known. Or rather, he had been unknowingly known all along. Raised under a different name, loved and guided by people who had hidden his true parentage, Gio had grown up with no awareness that his blood was steeped in Quartermaine history. But what of the girl? What name did she carry? What life had she lived, and in what shadows had she been kept? Tracy's obsession with finding answers transformed into a crusade. Her anger was no longer directed solely at Brook Lynn. It extended to Lois, whose past decisions Tracy now viewed as reckless and selfish. Lois, who had taken it upon herself to manage Brook Lynn's teenage pregnancy. who had facilitated the separation of the twins, and who had allowed Gio to be raised without knowledge of his true family, became the focal point of Tracy's blame. In Tracy's view, Lois had stolen from her, not just a great-grandchild, but two legacies, two future Quartermaines who could have secured the family's influence for another generation. Tracy's next move was swift and absolute. She demanded that both children be brought back, reclaimed, reabsorbed into the Quartermaine fold regardless of who had raised them or what kind of lives they now led. She saw this not as an act of compassion but as a restoration of order, of name, of heritage. She was determined to correct the chaos with control, to fill the void of lost years with strategy and power. The Quartermaine mansion, long accustomed to harboring family drama and scandal, now braced for a storm unlike any before. Secrets once whispered in shame had become declarations shouted in rage. Loyalties would be tested. Hearts would be broken. But to Tracy, none of that mattered. What mattered was legacy. And she would not rest until the Quartermaine name was once again whole, even if it meant tearing everyone else apart in the process. Tracy's fury surged to a boiling point, transforming her from a woman of strategic cold calculation into a tempest of righteous indignation and explosive resentment. Years of buried frustration, unresolved tensions, and seething contempt erupted all at once as she confronted Lois with the full weight of her accusations. To Tracy, Lois had always been the disruptive force that pulled Brook away from the Quartermaine legacy, the meddling outsider who refused to play by the unspoken but rigid rules of the family. But now, with the revelation of not one, but two lost children, and the sinister way it had all been handled, Tracy saw Lois not just as a nuisance, but as a threat. An architect of betrayal cloaked in maternal righteousness. Tracy didn't hold back. Her voice trembled with rage as she unleashed years of pent-up scorn. Every syllable struck with surgical precision, designed to cut deep. She laid the blame for Brook alienation squarely at Lois's feet. In her mind, it was Lois's influence that had convinced Brook to keep her pregnancy hidden. To give her child, or children, away rather than face the judgment and scrutiny of the Quartermaines. But what truly pushed Tracy over the edge was the manipulative, unilateral nature of Lois's decisions. She hadn't just helped her daughter through a crisis, she had commandeered it. Seizing control of the situation and dictating the fate of two innocent lives without ever consulting the very family whose name they carried. To Tracy, that wasn't love. It was domination. It was an attempt to rewrite history in Lois's favor, to erase the Quartermaine legacy and replace it with her own brand of moral superiority. Tracy accused Lois of exploiting Brook vulnerability during her teenage years, using it as an excuse to separate her from the family and impose her own vision of how the situation should be handled. And the most unforgivable act of all was the secret that had been kept for decades, the separation of the twins. Two children born together, twin souls with an unbreakable bond, torn apart before they had even taken their first breath in tandem. It was a decision that, in Tracy's eyes, bordered on cruel and calculated, a quiet monstrosity made all the worse by its covertness. But perhaps the most damning part of Tracy's tirade came when she turned her attention to Gio, the boy Lois had essentially raised in plain sight under an identity crafted to conceal the truth. Tracy's voice cracked not with sorrow, but with disbelief, disgust, and rage. Gio hadn't just been given away to strangers. He had been folded into Lois's life. Embraced and nurtured not as the grandson of the Quartermaine line, but as a nameless, disconnected boy growing up within Lois and Gloria's world. Tracy accused Lois of stealing from the family, not just a child, but a future, a legacy, a rightful place in the Quartermaine dynasty. What stung the most was that Gio had grown up surrounded by people who knew the truth. Lois and Gloria had watched him take his first steps, speak his first words, navigate his childhood and adolescence, all the while knowing he was the flesh and blood of Brook and Dante. And yet they said nothing. Not a single word. They denied Brook the chance to be a mother. They denied the family the opportunity to know and raise their heir. They had quietly, methodically, raised a Quartermaine child under a lie, and they had done it with a smile. Tracy's words were not merely bitter, they were surgical. She exposed every quiet manipulation, every whispered secret, and every decision Lois had made without the input or consent of those most affected by it. She portrayed Lois as a woman so wrapped in her own trauma, so unwilling to let go of past grievances with Ned and the Quartermaines, that she had poisoned the next generation's chance at unity and healing. In Tracy's mind, Lois hadn't acted out of love for Brook Lynn or protection for the children. She had acted out of spite, out of a deep-seated desire to keep a piece of the Quartermaines for herself, while simultaneously robbing the family of any role in the shaping of those lives. And yet, Tracy's fury was not purely about justice, it was about power. It was about reclaiming control. She wasn't just accusing Lois of personal betrayal, she was condemning her for political sabotage, for orchestrating a quiet rebellion against the Quartermaine lineage and executing it with frightening success. As the confrontation escalated, Tracy's venomous tone filled every corner of the room, each accusation landing like a slap across the face. Her eyes, once sharp with calculation, now burned with the weight of generational anger and grief. Her chest heaved, not from the exertion of yelling, but from the agony of knowing how deeply fractured her family had become, and that someone she had always suspected now stood revealed as the architect of that fracture. But Lois didn't cower. Her silence, her expression, her refusal to flinch only enraged Tracy more. In Lois's stillness, Tracy saw defiance, saw pride, saw an unrepentant protector who still believed she had done the right thing. And that, more than anything, was what Tracy could not forgive. Tracy did not waver. With the full force of her authority and unrelenting conviction, she declared her next move with terrifying finality: both children, Gio and his twin sister, wherever she might be, would be brought back into the Quartermaine fold. It was not a request. It was not a suggestion. It was an order delivered with the unmistakable edge of a woman who had long ago ceased to concern herself with sentimentality. To Tracy, this wasn't just about reunion or redemption, it was about reclamation. These were not simply long-lost members of the family, they were symbols of a legacy that had been splintered, twisted, and hidden in the shadows. And Tracy was determined to restore that legacy at any cost. In her mind, the blood of the Quartermaines was not something to be diluted, lost, or hidden. It was a birthright, a lineage steeped in power, wealth, and strategic brilliance, something she had spent a lifetime guarding with claws bared. And now, that legacy had been endangered by decisions made in secrecy, in fear, and worst of all, in rebellion. That would not stand. Not under her watch. She made it clear that the children, regardless of who raised them, loved them, or claimed them, belonged to the Quartermaines now. She would find the girl, just as surely as Gio had been revealed. And once both children were back under her roof, she would begin shaping them into the heirs they were always meant to be. In Tracy's world, family was not a sanctuary, it was a battlefield. And every soldier needed to be where they were most useful. Bloodline was duty. Heritage was responsibility. And affection? Affection was a luxury that came second, if at all. Those standing in the room began to see Tracy not merely as a matriarch, but as a monarch. Her commands were not born of love, but of loyalty to a dynasty. In her presence, the concept of family transformed, no longer defined by tenderness, but by allegiance, strategy, and calculated legacy building. Every move Tracy made was a masterstroke on a chessboard only she fully understood, and every person in that house, Ned, Olivia, Dante, even Brook Lynn, was but a piece she was determined to place exactly where she wanted. But while Tracy orchestrated her campaign to reclaim what she believed was hers, the emotional wreckage she left behind deepened beyond repair, especially in the heart of Brook Lynn. Brook Lynn had grown up with many doubts, many insecurities, and many regrets. But the one thing she had always clung to, even in her darkest moments, was the belief that her mother, Lois, had protected her with love, even if it meant making hard decisions. But that belief crumbled into ash when the truth finally hit her with full force. Her son, Gio, had been by her side for years. His true identity masked behind a web of secrecy and good intentions that now felt like chains of betrayal. And worse, there was a daughter. A daughter out there somewhere. Living a life entirely separate from the woman who gave her life. A daughter Brook Lynn had never known, never named, never touched. A daughter who may never even know she existed. The magnitude of that loss consumed her. Brook Lynn stood in the ruins of her own history, the air around her thick with shock, grief, and the kind of heartbreak that had no name. Her mind could not grasp the weight of it all, the stolen years, the missed milestones, the lies that had been laid carefully and quietly at her feet until they formed the floor she now stood on. A floor that had just collapsed beneath her. She looked at Lois not with anger alone, but with devastation. The woman she had once defended against the icy manipulations of Tracy now stood before her exposed, not as a villain, but as someone whose love had crossed boundaries into unforgivable betrayal. Lois had believed she was doing what was best, what would protect Brook Lynn, what would preserve peace, what would shield everyone from pain. But all she had truly done was build a dam against the flood, and now, that dam had burst. The betrayal was not just in the deception, but in the opportunity that had been stolen from her. Brook Lynn hadn't merely lost time, she had lost identity, connection, motherhood. There were no lullabies in her memory, no birthdays marked with cake and candles. No first words whispered in her ear by the children who should have known her as Mom. And perhaps most painful of all, she had been robbed of the chance to decide for herself. Every decision had been made for her, about her, in her absence. She could feel the world tilting off its axis, everything she had once known, her childhood, her relationships. Her very sense of self, being rewritten in real time. Her knees buckled beneath the weight of this new reality. Grief carved its way into her chest like a blade. Sharper and deeper than she had ever thought possible. And through that pain, one truth rang clear in her mind: she would never forgive Lois. Not for hiding Gio, not for erasing her daughter. And not for smiling all these years as if nothing had ever happened. Brook Lynn no longer recognized the woman who stood before her, or herself. At that moment, Ned and Olivia stood completely stunned, caught in the eye of a storm that had shattered everything they thought they knew about their family. Ned. A man who had lived for years with the guilt of a distant and often fractured relationship with his daughter, now found himself paralyzed by the overwhelming truth: he was the grandfather of not one, but two children he never knew existed. The realization hit him with brutal force, leaving him grasping for a way to reconcile this newfound truth with all the time that had been irreversibly lost. Olivia, meanwhile, was frozen in silent disbelief. Struggling to process the revelation that their household had been home to Gio for years without them ever knowing that he was Brook Lynn's flesh and blood. The idea that they had shared meals, holidays, and everyday moments with a child who was, by all rights, a Quartermain heir, her stepson's son, left her with a dizzying sense of grief and confusion. Both Ned and Olivia were swept up in a cyclone of conflicting emotions: fury at the deception, guilt over their ignorance, sorrow for Brook Lynn's pain, and a deep, paralyzing helplessness as the full scope of the betrayal unraveled before them. Amid the emotional chaos, Lulu, whose investigative instincts had sparked the unraveling of all these secrets, found herself trapped in a storm of her own. She had pursued the truth because it was the right thing to do. She believed, with every fiber of her being, that no mother should be deprived of the knowledge of her own children's existence. And yet, despite the righteousness of her intentions, Lulu could not escape the feeling that she had become the villain in Brook Lynn's eyes. She felt the sting of rejection, of being cast out from the life of someone she had once loved as family. Lulu knew better than most that truth could be a weapon, sharp, devastating, and capable of cutting the deepest bonds to ribbons. But she also understood that justice sometimes demanded pain. And that letting the lie continue would have meant endorsing the theft of motherhood itself. And then, inevitably, all eyes turned toward Tracy, the woman at the center of it all, whose cold composure and unrelenting logic made her both feared and respected. She stood like an iron pillar amidst the emotional wreckage, offering no apologies, no visible remorse. To many, she appeared as ruthless as ever, a matriarch who placed legacy above love, order above compassion. But the question lingered in the air, unspoken yet palpable: was that all there was to her? Was Tracy truly as emotionally detached as she appeared, or was there something deeper, more fragile hidden beneath her armor? Was it possible that, somewhere within that hardened heart, Tracy did feel pain? That the years lost, the children hidden, and the family shattered had left their mark on her soul in ways she could never voice? Could it be that her obsession with control and power was nothing more than a desperate attempt to keep the loneliness at bay, to reclaim the time and connection she had lost and would never recover? That question remained, unanswered, unsettling, a wound that refused to close in the hearts of everyone in the Quartermain family. Inside the walls of their stately mansion, secrets had always lingered like ghosts, but now they refused to stay buried. Each new truth brought with it a storm of consequences, tearing through trust, kinship, and the fragile hope for peace. And so, the family stood on the precipice of yet another turning point. The children had been found. The lies had been unearthed. But would this reunion bring healing? Or would it only deepen the fractures that had already scarred them beyond repair? Would the truth be enough to rebuild what had been broken, or would it destroy what little was left?